Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Anthony Sattin. Anthony is a writer and broadcaster who has written many fiction and nonfiction works. He's a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. He's editorial advisor on Geographical Magazine. And he is the author of the latest book, Nomads, the Wanderers Who Shaped Our World. And that is what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about how humans are naturally nomadic. It actually is maybe not strange, but it's definitely not how we were for many thousands of years to be kind of settled in one place. We talk about many different sites and histories and empires. We talk about Göbekli Tepe, which is in Turkey. We talk about any of the early settlements. We talk about Uruk and the Epic of Gilgamesh. We talk about the domestication of horses. We talk about the Persian Empire, the Scythian Empire, and what nomadic identity looked like in each of these empires at different periods. We talk about the impact of Islam and Prophet Muhammad. We talk about Chinggis Khan and the Mongol Empire, Ottoman Empire, and what nomadic identity looked like during the long Ottoman Empire. Talk about Native Americans in the United States, the future of nomads, and many other topics. This is a topic and conversation I absolutely love coming back to. I think that so much of our history as humans on the planet have to do with this nomadic nature. We still do this today in different ways, in different forms. And I think it's just really important to know about these people groups and these empires and these histories that feel very human for kind of our anthropology of understanding what it means to be nomadic in a lot of ways. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so like, follow, subscribe, share, contribute, all the wonderful things. I appreciate everyone's support. And now I bring you Anthony Sattin. I am here with Anthony Sattin. Anthony, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very delighted to be talking with you.
Xavier, thank you for inviting me. Great to be here.
Yes, absolutely. You wrote a wonderful book, a book that has a big interest for me, and it was really superb. The book is called Nomads, the Wanderers Who Shaped Our World, and it's out through Norton, and it really was just a treat to read. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do, why don't you just tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, all the relevant pieces, and what you're currently up to.
Okay. Well, my name is Anthony Sattin. I'm British-born, Anglo-American, and for about the last 35 years, I've been on the move. I started out as a novelist, actually. That was what I intended to do with my life. And then I got lured into traveling and travel writing by the Sunday Times. In the time when they had money, and they'd say, "Where do you want to go?" And "Oh, here's a wad of cash. You'll need that." And they, yeah, people laugh about it now. And so for a long time, I had a very happy time traveling around the world, writing features for the Sunday Times and trying to write novels. And then I started writing history, which has always been my passion. And I've written quite a few books. You mentioned Nomads, which is clearly a history book. I mean, there's a little bit about me traveling in it, but mostly it's history, 12,000 years of history. But the book before that, for instance, was a biography of Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. And it was, all my books are an attempt to answer questions that I can't find the answer to. And the question to that I was trying to answer there was, how do you go from being the second son of a middle-class Oxford family to becoming Lawrence of Arabia? I mean, what sort of transformation, what drove this man? What happened to him? And before that, I wrote a book about Florence Nightingale and Gustave Flaubert on the Nile. Anyway, I've done books that don't necessarily fit together. Biographies, histories. I wrote one travel book, and I've had a lot of fun doing it.
So at the very least, you're a good writer. We can say that. We can definitely say that for sure.
Thank you.
I haven't read the previous book. I'll have to read it. I just saw Lawrence of Arabia, again, I've seen it many times. One of my favorite films. But there was a 70 millimeter print at a theater by my house, and I said I absolutely have to see this in 70 millimeter, and it was, it was just an experience to see. So I don't know outside from the movie too much about his life. I mean, again, it's a movie, so I'm sure there's many things that are Hollywoodized and stuff. So I'll have to check out what you wrote about.
The movie was pretty good actually, and
Is it?
yeah, but it opens with his death, which is no spoiler at all, obviously. And then it jumps to the map room in Cairo during the First World War, 1916, and he's in uniform. He's a very, very junior officer, and then about 5 minutes later, he's in a tent with one of the Hashemite princes speaking Arabic, and you think, hold on, how does that happen? So my book was an attempt it was really the prequel to that film, because most people have never read Lawrence of Arabia, have never read, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, the book he wrote, and they've never read the authorized biography. It's about 600 pages, and it's quite dry. So I wanted to, so I wrote something that I hope reads like a novel, and sets out to explain. There's a line he came out with after the war where he said, "Everything I did for somebody I loved." A young man, anyway, I quickly realized that what we have here is a gay love story. He's in love with it. I mean, there's no sex. I tried very hard to find that, but partly because this young man is very young when he meets him. He's only about 13, and Lawrence is 21. But he really takes him on as his protege and brings him up because before the war, Lawrence was working as an archaeologist in Syria, and so he's a young Syrian. And anyway, what I set out to do was to write that story, which I think works very, very, very well. And I'm hoping somebody will make a movie of it.
Yeah, there you go. I'm sure there's something to be said for that. If it could sell in the '60s, to do Lawrence of Arabia, maybe someone will make that movie out of the prequel.
Yeah, but there's no Peter O'Toole. That's the problem.
There's no Peter O'Toole and no David Lean anymore.
That's right. That's right.
So about the new book. The new book is really, really, really nice. Also very much like a kind of journey of sorts. As you said, it goes through a large span of time, 12,000 years. I guess the first question I had when I was reading it and thinking about it was, what is it about us as humans? I think most people attribute Homo erectus as the first, precursor human to kind of walk out of Africa and start going around the world. And what is it about, I guess, humans that makes us nomadic, right? So we have so much of our history is kind of going and exploring and being inquisitive and trying to figure out what's this new place here, what's around the bush here, what's over the mountain here. I guess, what is it about our history that just makes us nomadic, I guess?
I think actually the question, we should turn it around and say, what is it about humans that makes us want to settle? Because I think movement is our natural state. And, before, the reason why I start the book at 9,500 BC, I mean, it's not a random date, because before that, more or less all humans on the planet are living a mobile life. I mean, there is no such thing as a town or a city. There's no domestication of crops or animals. So we really are. We're hunter gatherers, and the thing about hunter gatherers is you can't really have a large community hanging together, because I think you can only support, I can't remember the exact number, but it's maybe 25 or 35 people per square mile. In your average hunter-gatherer environment, which means you can't have large communities. But humans are very sociable. So we would gather at places and eat everything that could be eaten, kill everything that could be killed for the table. Any beast, anything that flew, anything that ran, anything that crawled, pick everything off the trees, the bushes. And yet there's a turning point at 9,500 BC, or around there, and it happens in a place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and I think we're going to come on to that. But it's a desire to gather and to gather in numbers that makes people have to start domesticating and cultivating things. But before that, our natural state, and it still is our natural state, is to move. When we're babies, when we cry, we get calmed by rocking. It's in our DNA. And it's a cliche to say that life is a journey from cradle to grave, but it literally is. And I can't remember which philosopher in the 18th century, 19th centuries, 18th century said, when we stop moving, we die. We are effectively in movement until we're in the grave. So that's our natural state. And some of us are better suited now to living a settled life, to living within four walls. And some of us are not. And some of us are in between, because since I wrote this book, Nomads, a lot of people have said to me, well, of course you did. I mean, you're constantly on the move. But actually, I'm a complete schizophrenic, because half of me loves moving around, and half of me is a real homeboy. I need my books, I need my space.
I very much resonate with that. I love moving around. I love mountains. I love going places, but I also love just being at home, again, with a good glass of something and reading a book and just staying in for a couple of days. So I'm very much with you on that. I guess before we get to Turkey, or modern day Turkey, I guess, and some of the stuff you talk about in the beginning of the book, I guess in terms of how we conceptualize, nomads or nomadic groups, if you want to, I mean, how do we define a nomad as opposed to someone that's non-nomadic, someone that's more, hemmed into one place and kind of stays there, doesn't really move about or whatever? I think you're right. I mean, for so much of us, that was kind of strange, right? To settle in a city or community. And so we were always moving around. But I guess just as an operational definition, how do you see the term nomad? What's the importance of understanding how we think about that?
I think, I use it as a sort of movable word, because at the very beginning, the roots of the word are Indo-European, which means that back, but long before recorded history. And it comes out as a word that refers to somebody who has the right to pasture, or the need to pasture, which means that they have an animal that they need to feed. And the thing about, as you'll know about animals, sheep, goats, camels, horses, whatever, is that if you put a lot of them in one particular place, they're going to eat everything, as humans do, and therefore you have to move them around from place to place. There's summer and winter grazing, and that's the absolute core definition of a nomad. But out of that, obviously, has come, down to our own time, this sort of very romantic, oh, you're so nomadic, which implies that you're a free spirit, you go wherever you want, you could do what. I mean, that's absolutely not the core meaning of the word nomad, but in our time, it's very much come to mean that. And so we have digital nomads, people who, with a screen and an internet connection, can go and live and work wherever they want. And I don't mind that application at all. I mean, I don't think they can be compared to nomads with animals, because there are different obligations on those two groups. And I think that difference is very important. And I'm sure we'll come to that in a bit. Yeah. But anyway, a nomad is somebody who's got animals that they need to feed.
So you mentioned the site. Is it a Göbekli Tepe?
Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli Tepe, yeah. It's just in southeast Turkey, is this right?
That's right. And I mean, the name means Potbelly Hill. We can call it Potbelly Hill.
Yeah. Well, I love the original term, but I guess that I didn't know. I loosely heard about this, but I didn't know too much about it. And you spend a lot of time talking about it. You say here in the book, it's one of the world's most important and exciting archaeological sites, and is not a household name, only because there's no golden treasure that's been found, which is right. I mean, it's not a very common thing. Most people wouldn't know about it. But they have these stone pillars. There was obviously people that had lived there, and then they moved about, and then they came back. There were these strange stone-built circles. Tell us about this place. Tell us about what we think happened. I mean, we're talking about, I guess, 8,000 years, BC. and why it's so essential. Why is it kind of like the starting point for talking about, nomads?
Well, it's incredibly old, and it's only recently been found. I mean, that's what some really, really mean reviewer in the United States criticized me for talking about Göbekli Tepe and not mentioning another site, but that other site called Kurhan Tepe, which is very close to Göbekli Tepe, had not been discovered when I wrote this book. So I thought that was a little mean. I mean, that's how fresh this research is. It's happening now. And I couldn't have written I probably couldn't have written this book 30 years ago. But in the 1990s, there was a German Neolithic archaeologist who had been working on the Turks down in the south near the Syrian border were building a dam on the Euphrates River. And there's some very, very old sites there. And he was part of a team that were doing salvage archaeology to get whatever they could out of the site because it was going to be flooded. So there's 6 months, manically working. It's not normally how they would work. They would work much slower. And at the end of that project, the whole team went back to Germany, but he felt there was more to be found. And he was just driving around, talking to people and whatever, and he heard from a shepherd about a site which had been described as Byzantine, so maybe a little bit older, so sort of maybe only 2,000 years old, to thereabouts, but where there had been flints found on the surface. And he, as a Neolithics expert, knew that in that place, flints were not a natural stone, but they'd been brought to cut the limestone. That was his guess. He's like, why there aren't any flints there, so they must have someone's brought them to work the stone. And what the previous archaeologists had thought were just slabs laid on the ground from the Byzantine period turned out to be the top of 10 or 12 feet high pillars that had been buried in the ground. So literally you're on the top of the site. I met him, sadly, just before he died. I was doing a fundraiser with him in London, and he died very, very young, in mid-excavation of this site. But he said he knew, as soon as he saw that he either had to walk away from it or it would be the rest of his life. It was going to be something so major. Wow. So he went away. He went and got permission from the Turkish government to work at this site. He raised money, and then he went back and he started. And as he cleared this pillar, the soil away from the pillar, he realized it was one of a circle of 12. And you think about stones in circles, you think about Stonehenge in England. This is 7,000 years before Stonehenge. Wow. 7,000 years before the pyramids. And you think this is so early. And so you've got 12 T-shaped pillars, 10 or 12 feet high, in a circle with two bigger ones in the middle. And the pillars are carved. They're cut limestone. And they've been carved with images of humans and animals. Wow. And this is so far before anybody thought that that humans were doing this sort of thing, that it immediately pushed all the barriers back. And I'm sure that I mentioned that since I wrote the book, another site similar with these pillars has been found. And I'm sure that in 10 or 20 years' time, they'll find maybe in that area something that goes back another 10,000 years. Why not? I don't suppose that these people were the first to do this because the pillars are so sophisticated in their execution. So, the mind reels at having to sort of push everything back. And, who were these people? We don't know. We know nothing except for what they left behind. We know they met there. They brewed beer in industrial quantities. And they ate a lot. And Klaus Schmidt, who the German archaeologist who found it, said what he thought was that these are people who were hunter-gatherers who, and at that time Turkey was a bit like East Africa. There were seasonal rains, herds of wild animals came in, and this was at the end of a gully, so it would be a very good place to trap animals and kill them as you chase them up the valley, and then they get stuck, and then there's the cull. And he also thought it was the site of something that we didn't quite understand. It was a sacred site. Why else would you go to all that effort to build something so complicated? But in the process of building it, they couldn't possibly have fed the number of people it would take to cut and move. They only moved the stone less than a kilometer, but still they had to move it and then erect it and carve it. It's more than 30 or 40 people. And so in the process, they had to start domesticating food, cultivating their own food. And so then that's the beginning of proper human settlement. So you have these extraordinary monuments that are built by people who live on the move, but it's the beginning of proper settlement as we understand it. And it's just so extraordinary.
I mean, it is extraordinary. And it's one of those things where, I'm sure, like yourself, I mean, I have a million questions. Who are these people? Was this a spiritual religious thing or a cult practice? Why did they settle there? Why did they do that for a time? There's so many things. There's so many things to wonder. And, obviously, maybe we'll never know. Maybe we will. But it is interesting to think about generally. So long ago, we see people settle. Or have elements of settling, or elements of domesticating, or things that we do today, and it's very, very incredible to see how old that is. Like you're saying before the pyramids, like that's it's pretty old. That's a long time ago.
7,000 years before the pyramids. We are closer to the pyramid builders than the pyramid builders were the people who put up Göbekli Tepe. I mean, that's
so wild.
It's difficult to comprehend. And all we know about them is what they left behind. And because one day they just got, after about 1,500 years, they just got up and left. And so we don't know why they left this place. Maybe there was some a sort of COVID-like disease sort of swept through, and everybody said, "I'm getting out of here." Maybe something terrible happened. Maybe there was a volcano nearby that exploded because it's volcanic. Something happened, and everybody said, "We're off," and they left.
I guess it's interesting, right? Because you spend time there, and then as you move through the book, obviously as it's going to happen, we get to Anatolia, and then we'll get to Mesopotamia after that. But there's another place in modern day Turkey. Turkey is rich with history, right? Ancient history, and even up to the modern day. We get to another place after this, which is in and around Anatolia. What is it about? And this has happened numerous times at different parts in the history of humans. There's something about this region in modern day Turkey that people just seem to like. I don't know if it's the air. I don't know if it's the mountains. I don't know if it's the good soil. But tell us about Anatolia at this time, as much as we know, this other city, and how what we can glean from that, and understanding how nomads wanted to kind of again a bit settle there of sorts.
Yeah, so we're in the 6,000s BC. So we've jumped on a couple of thousand years from Göbekli Tepe, and we're in a place called Çatalhöyük, which is one of the earliest settlements as we would recognize it as a settlement. People built houses. One next to the other. In fact, it's one solid block. No doors. The door is on the roof. So they're literally sort of pushed up right against the other. You walk, there would be a steps or a ladder up to the roof of this whole compound, presumably because they were worried about animals and other people getting in. And then you would have a hole in the roof, a trapdoor in the roof, and then stairs down into your living space, which is where you cooked, you slept, and you made sacrifices, because we know that there were things like bull's horns set into the wall of the house. And well, what is it about this area? Well, for one thing, it's one of the sort of key crossing points in the world. If you're coming out of Africa, you go up what's now Palestine and Israel, and you end up in Anatolia. If you're coming from the east, you go under the Caspian Sea, you end up in Anatolia. It's just one of those one of those key places on the planet where people have always gone through. And it's been very good for herding, not so great for agriculture, but very good for herding. So it did suit nomads, nomadic people, and I think most of the early settlements were probably only occupied for maybe half the year. These are people who would have herded their animals somewhere else, maybe during the summer, and this would have been their winter quarters. And it still happens, in that area as well. I write about that with people I met in Iran who have their summer and winter places, and their winter places are increasingly looking like houses, not tents. Because if you can build a house, why wouldn't you now? But there's also something about these two rivers. I mentioned the Euphrates and the Tigris, which are the two rivers that create what as you called it Mesopotamia, which is now mostly in Iraq, partly in Syria and Turkey. And so you have these two rivers that provide a huge amount of water. It's not quite as wonderful as the Nile Valley. I mean, the ancient Mesopotamians looked rather jealously at the ancient Egyptians because the Nile used to burst its banks, and when it went down, when the water receded, it left this layer of silt that made the land very fertile. But in Mesopotamia, you're sitting between two rivers, but you're still having to irrigate your fields. But it was always because of these two rivers, and because they also form a natural barrier. It was a relatively safe place to be, and it was very, very good for herding and for some agriculture. And right back in the sort of 2000s, 3000s BC, there are records of the cohabitation between settled people and nomads, people who are farming, and people who come in with their animals to eat the stubble after the crops have been brought in. And you need them to eat the stubble, and you need them their animals to leave their droppings to fertilize the land for the next year. So this is from the very beginning of recorded time, this happy symbiotic relation between settled and nomadic people. I mean, it comes down to us through the Bible as Cain and Abel, as this sort of rather difficult relationship that ends in murder. But for most of the time, between settled and nomadic people, it's a very happy relationship because they needed each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. I totally get you about the Anatolia or much of Turkey is a kind of crossroads. I think Constantinople, Istanbul also was kind of like the nexus of the world. Kind of meeting east-west. But in Mesopotamia, it's interesting. Yeah, many people know if they've done any reading of the Bible, they'll know the Tigris, Euphrates, things like that. But you get these like actual like cities or beginnings of civilization. Obviously, you have Nineveh and you have Urdu and Uruk, and you have all these places in and around modern day Iraq. What is it, I guess, in this time and in this region? There's one thing to like, okay, settle, this is good for herding, but what would kind of make people, or what would be the incentive to say, let's actually build, homes or erect structures and have a kind of township? And what is it, I guess, about that? Was it just really good? It's like, maybe we just settle here and we don't need to keep moving about. What is it that we start to see these kind of civilizations start to kind of pop up in this time in this region?
That's a really interesting question. And I wish I had a really definitive answer for you, but I don't. I mean, I think because they could is one good answer. Because it was a very happy land. It's not called the Fertile Crescent for nothing. It was a very generous place to live for that. And also because it was a place in the beginning of recorded time, so it's from the early 3000s BC. We've jumped on another 3,000 years from Çatalhöyük. It's a place where the gods are in communication with people, and so it becomes a place where you have a lot of really important sacred sites, which then become well, you mentioned the cities. They become cities. I mean, Uruk, which you mentioned, which is associated with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest complete stories we have from history. Certainly written down by the mid 2000s BC, but it was obviously being told long before that, and it reflects probably some things that really happened, because it's a story between the king of Uruk, this man called Gilgamesh, who's sort of immensely proud, and as he should be, of his city and its walls. Look at my walls, nobody can get through there. And you begin to wonder whether the walls are there to keep people out or to keep the people in, because it turns out that Gilgamesh is something of a tyrant, notably insisting on having the right to bed any bride first before the groom gets there. There's clearly everyone's complaining to the gods, and the gods then send a counterpart to Gilgamesh, a natural wild man called Enkidu, who runs with the beasts. And when Gilgamesh hears about Enkidu, he knows that the gods have sent this being to tame him. So he sets out to tame Enkidu and sends the translation, the original text is ambivalent, but she's a beautiful woman from the temple. She could be one of the temple prostitutes, we're not sure. But anyway, she goes to the lake where the wild animals come and drink, and waits for Enkidu to come, because he's running with the wild animals. And she stands there naked, and he's obviously never seen a naked woman before, and so he stops, and they have sort of extraordinary and wonderful sex for many, many, many days, and at the end of which he discovers he can't run with the animals anymore. Either he doesn't have the energy to do it, or they can smell that he's changed. It's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden again. He's lost that ability to live in the natural world. And so she prepares him. She takes him to a camp of some hunters where because he's very, very hairy. And they trim his hair. Then she has clothes made for him, and he's given a weapon because he's going to the city. He'll need that. And then he goes and meets Gilgamesh, and you have these two hugely powerful characters. Gilgamesh is half human, half divine. And they fight. And they realize they can't, neither one can get the upper hand. And so they become friends. But Gilgamesh uses Enkidu's powers to go on a journey which, as the Gilgamesh epic says, should never have been made. And that is, they go to kill the bull of heaven that is protecting the cedar, the great forest, the cedar forest. And effectively, this is man interfering with the natural world. This is in a narrative form, a reflection of an anxiety about the effects that humans even then were having on the natural world, cutting down trees, killing wild animals. And it ends tragically, because of this sin that they've committed by killing the bull. The gods insist that there has to be a price to pay. And Enkidu, the wild man, tamed, is the one who's sacrificed and who dies. And there's a beautiful thing where Gilgamesh he's so distraught he won't let his friend be buried until the first maggot comes out of his nose. And it's partly also, and so much of what happens in Mesopotamia is connected to this, it's also trying to understand our place, our human place in the world, and why we're here. So he begins, Gilgamesh goes on this great journey effectively to the other world to find out, what is the meaning of life? Well, we're still asking that question. What the hell are we here for? What is the meaning of life?
Yeah, you summarized it super well. I reread it last year, and it's just such to say it's timeless is kind of an understatement. It's such a wonderful epic, and I think mostly it's because it just feels just very human. Many of the themes that you're saying there just feel it's a human story. It's it's very much like resonates in that way. It's spectacular. There's many things to pull from it, but it's just very spectacular in that way. So many things that we could keep landing here in Mesopotamia. Obviously, there's many things to discuss, and you do in the book in some ways. I do want to ask briefly here, because it's something I've learned over the years, that is really essential. And I think maybe because we don't use it anymore in the same way, is we sort of forget this, but the domestication of horses is really, 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 really important. One of the most important things, and this is in the Altiac region, and how this not only stays there but spreads all over the world. I mean, we were using horses, as main transportation 120 years ago, and maybe in some places people still do. So, and with that, you get languages and things like that. But just generally, tell us about this region and horses and language, and how did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, imagine a world without horses and horse riders.
Right.
The most successful, enduring form of transport, apart from our own feet, that humans have ever had. I mean, the petrol engine will have lasted about 140 years by the time it's phased out. Horses we've been riding horses for 5,000 years at least, and it came about. Well, we can't know. We know more or less where it is above the Caspian Sea, on the Pontic steppes, the extension of this huge, extraordinary steppe land that goes from Hungary the whole way to China. At the western edge of that, that's where it appears humans learnt to ride, or if at least that's where the oldest bridles have been found, and. It's possible that people were riding horses elsewhere, but earlier than this. But certainly we know there, in the 3000s at least, the middle of the 3000s, that humans were riding horses. And before they were riding them, they were using them to pull carts and do other things. And horses are very, very good on this steppe land that I've just mentioned, because in the summer, there's plenty of grass to eat. Horses eat grass. That's great. But in the winter, it's very, very, very cold, and the surface is frozen. But horses have hooves, and they're very good at getting through the ice and getting to the grass underneath. So unless it's a really bad winter, horses can survive on the steppes. So, which is why they flourished there, and they were wild, and then they were tamed. And you think, I wonder how long it was that humans had tamed horses before somebody thought, hey, why don't I get up on that and see what happens?
It's exactly that's my thought too. Anytime I've read about this, I'm like, how long did it take? But it's like, I can get on top of you and ride you, and we can kind of be, closely aligned. How long did that take?
Yeah, but then there's many how longs. The ancient Egyptians had chickens in about 1400 BC, but they didn't eat them for hundreds and hundreds of years. They kept them as pets.
It's
the same thing. But obviously one day somebody thought, I'm going to get up on that. Was it some young kid showing off? Was it, who knows? But we've all seen the rodeo. But imagine a rodeo where you don't have a rope around the neck. You're just holding on to the mane. But we also know that if you hang on for long enough, that the horse will eventually calm down, and then you can ride it. And, at that point, the world is transformed, because the people who lived on the steppes, who used to only be able to get as far as they could with their ox carts, which were very, very slow, could suddenly ride. And therefore, it's the difference between having a bicycle and having a motorbike. I mean, suddenly, distance is possible. And the world is transformed accordingly. And I think, out of that, it comes down into Mesopotamia off the steppes, because that's where, when you come down beside the Caspian Sea, you come into Mesopotamia, and then it spreads into Europe, it spreads down into Africa to Egypt. And it changes the world. And as I said, imagine the world without horses. You see images of the New York fire department in the 1910s. Still, their fire trucks were being pulled by horses. It was nomads that did that.
It's very interesting to see how we, as you have with many nomadic peoples, as you start to kind of traverse big areas of land, you start to bring culture and tradition and language, which is really, really interesting. You see how that works. And so as you kind of take us throughout the book, we get to, modern day, Iran, or in previously is Persia, this big empire, this big empire that was there for a long time, and they also have a strong nomadic influence in their origins. You talk about Herodotus and documenting the histories and things like that. I guess, what do you want to say, I guess, about Persia's influence here? Because they've been a very large empire, at least in more modern terms, 2,000 years, and before that. But what's their kind of contribution here? Because they also have different types of terrain, big mountain structures, they have their own history. What's the kind of integration here of nomadic peoples residing in, so we see Turkey, modern day Turkey, we see Mesopotamia, but then we see over here more in the east in modern day Iran. What's the story here, I guess?
Well, a statistic that I didn't have when I wrote the book, which I wish I had, is the majority of our planet is not fit for agriculture. Think of mountains, think of deserts, think of agriculture needs a certain sort of generally gentle, fertile land. The rest of it is very good for herders, for nomads, and Iran ancient Persia is a very good example because, as you say, the majority of the country, there's a huge upland plateau which is mostly desert. Surrounded by mountains, which are again not fit for agriculture, and you have this sort of beautiful fringe around the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, which is good for agriculture. But there's not a lot of it. So you have people who were naturally nomadic, and around the 500s BC, you have a tribal leader called Cyrus who. He's a politician. He gathers people together. He convinces the tribes around him that they're stronger together than they are apart. And then they famously conquer another tribe, the Medes, who had a large part of land. And out of this, he fashions what was then the largest empire the world had ever seen. Cyrus the Great rules from into Central Asia down to the Mediterranean, and it's a significant empire. And out of it comes you mentioned these are people who still have to live on the move because they're still nomads. There's a wonderful moment in a radio program because Cyrus's successor is a king called Darius the Great, and he builds a site called which the Greeks called Persepolis. It's there's a big mountain, obviously a sacred mountain, and they built this enormous platform up against the mountain, which had a palace on the top. But the significant thing is it's a platform. It's where you can get thousands of people standing on this man-made base at the foot of a big mountain. And in this radio program, I won't embarrass the host by naming him, but he was running a program about Persepolis, and he said, so at what point did the Persians stop being nomadic? And there's the awkward silence, and the three academics who were on the program said, well, they never stopped being nomadic because they can't. You can't live any other way there. Mm-hmm. And so the Greeks had called this place Persepolis which is the city of the Pars, which are the people. But they didn't live there. It wasn't their capital. They never had a one place where they could live. They were constantly in motion. They met there once a year, and they insisted that all the tributary nations in their great empire came once a year. It was probably a reenactment of the divine state of the king, that he would stand in front of the mountain and perform ceremonies, and people would pay tribute to him. And that is the basis of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire it's constantly fluid and sort of constantly in motion, rather like their nomadic sort of nature, because it grows, it falls apart. There's a new emperor comes along who's at one point all of Egypt and the whole way up into Turkey and a big chunk of Central Asia is also part of the Persian Empire. Heading up into Europe is beginning to fall to the Persians. But there's one people, and I definitely want to talk about them, called the Scythians.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this, please.
Yeah, I want to talk about Scythian.
Yeah, so interesting.
So here's another nomad tribe. And we don't know what they were called because the Persians left very, very few written records. They left some monuments, which is unusual for nomads, but they didn't trust writing. So an entirely oral tradition. And this is typical of nomads. And in a way, part of the difficulty I had in writing this book is there's so few original nomadic sources outside of physical artifacts. There aren't the big texts. And so most of the accounts we have of nomads in the ancient world have come from settled people. You mentioned Herodotus. I mean, he travels widely. In China, there's the grand historian of China who writes about a Chinese nomadic tribe who seem very close to the Scythians. So we don't know what the Scythians called themselves. And their counterpart at exactly the same time, 500s, 400s, 300s BC, up until about 200 AD, called the Xiongnu. We know the Xiongnu were not called the Xiongnu because it translates as illegitimate offspring of slaves. And I don't know of any people in the world who would willingly choose them to call themselves illegitimate or the offspring of slaves. But what we can tell from these people is that they are true nomads. They don't build towns or cities. They move between summer and winter pastures. They constantly herd. They do also raise some crops, but not many. And there's a wonderful story that Herodotus tells about Cyrus going after the Scythians further into Central Asia. And I think this goes the whole way into what's now Afghanistan, this conflict. And the Scythian queen, they have a queen, not a king at that time, called Tomiris, sends a note to Cyrus saying, don't cross the rivers, I don't need to have a conflict with you, and you don't need to have one with me, but in the end, there is a big confrontation, and Cyrus the Great, the emperor of the greatest empire the world has known, has his head chopped off by a Scythian nomad, and his head is brought to the queen, and she puts it in a bag of blood and says, "Sate your thirst, O you bloodthirsty Persian." And then jump forward to his famous successor Darius, and Darius claims to have gone after the Scythians as well, and to have conquered them. But he never did. And Herodotus has a great story about this because Darius apparently crosses into Scythian territory with 700,000 people. It's quite a big supply chain.
It's very large.
As this huge Persian army moves forward, so the Scythians just move away. And finally, Darius sends a fast messenger and says to the Scythian king at that point, and says, "Well, look, either fight or send me tribute as your king." And the Scythian king says, "Why would we fight? We have nothing to lose. We have no cities you can burn. We have no crops you can destroy. We have nothing that you could possibly do to apart from our graves." And this is and all we have from the Scythians, almost all we have, are their graves. And they built these huge mounds of some of them are about 50 meters and bigger across. And some of the royal ones, you had a mass execution, sacrifice of horses. So horse heads were buried all around the perimeter of the mound. And then you'd have a passageway into the middle of it. And then in the middle, you'd have a room decorated with, one of them has worn stones, done as a sort of mosaic on the floor, taken from a river, and we're a long way from rivers where this place is. And the walls are made of wood, and sometimes they're buried sitting up on a throne. Sometimes with the women, they're wearing gold jewelry, and you find these sophisticated burials the whole way across the Eurasian steppe, from near Hungary to China, and all from about the same period, from, say, 400 BC to about 200 AD. And they have the same things in them. They have Persian carpets, they have Chinese silk, they have Byzantine or Roman gold jewelry. They have, and so what we can say about these people is that they were if you study the history of this period, then you get told about the great Roman Empire and the great Han Chinese Empire, these two poles of civilization. Well, between them, it appears there was a nomad empire, an alliance of nomad states who were clearly trading with each other, that covers an area that was bigger than either the Chinese or the Roman Empire. So it's possible that actually there was the glue between the Chinese and Roman, because there was never a Chinese trader seen in ancient Rome, and never a Roman trader seen in ancient China. And yet things move across, and not just goods, but also ideas, as you say, and languages, beliefs, religions. These people in between who are nomads are the fertilizers of what we call the civilized world.
That's a really nice way of saying it. It reminds me, as I'm listening to you say all this, there was a book that was out, I'm sure there's been papers written too. Chris Beckwith wrote this book, The Scythian Empire. Fabulous book. It's very, very, very good. And he kind of just details all this. And I was surprised to learn, how much of the Medes and the Persian Empire was basically a kind of submersion from Scythians, but then he spends a good amount of time talking about their adventures within the Chinese Empire, which kind of blew me away. I was not expecting that. And I think the way you're describing it is a nice way of this kind of bridge or linkage, or this kind of way of some kind of adhesive that's connecting these regions and areas with this nomadic sort of empire of sorts. It's really, really, really spectacular. And there's this strange thing of, I guess what makes them interesting is because of how elusive they are. It's almost like they're kind of sort of alluded to in the background. They never come to the foreground, but they seem super essential, super important, and obviously very old. So it's hard to know, but very, very fascinating.
And again, we have to rely on the accounts of settled people. For what we know. But so Herodotus, and I mentioned the grand historian of China, and other people write about them as well. I mean, because you have Scythians in ancient Greece as well, because they, Herodotus and the grand historian of China come out with an almost identical description of these nomads, that their children are put on horseback, before they can walk, and they're taught to fire a bow before they can, almost before they can do anything else. And so they're incredibly skilled at as fighters. So the ancient Greeks used Scythian archers in their defense, but they also inevitably mocked them for being, barbarians. And so in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece, there was this sort of, this insult. You're as drunk as a Scythian, because Romans and Greeks tended to dilute their wine, but the Scythians drank it neat.
I see.
Bit like Scots with their whiskey.
Right. Oh yeah.
So it was drunk as and the other thing about Scythians is they used cannabis. And Herodotus has a great description, although he doesn't fully understand what it is that he's describing. But they built tents, and they would have a sort of bunch of this weed burning inside the tent, and they'd all go in and they'd all come out giggling.
they were hotboxing in the tent.
Yeah,
It's hilarious.
Exactly. But there was a really great exhibition about the Scythians at the British Museum in London a few years ago, and that was fascinating, because I remember when it was announced, people saying, "What? This is a major exhibition? We've never even heard of them. Who the hell are they?" And then, and the objects in the exhibition were fascinating as well, because they'd come out of the burials. So, for instance, there was skin, human skin, with tattoos, because they tattooed themselves.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
And some of the gold jewelry that I mentioned, and a tripod for burning marijuana, and sort of various other bits and pieces.
Super cool.
But it was really, it was you walked in and you think, this is another world, this is something else entirely.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow, it's really cool that they were able to do that. That would have been such a delight to see. Wow. So we get to like the middle of the book, I guess, and obviously there's so much history here. I guess the main question I want to ask, I mean, just generally as we go through, I mean, there's some more common names that people will know here, but I guess how does this, anybody that's moving through time, there's a kind of slow evolution of things. You get from one period to another period, and you have other things that happen. So maybe it's a kind of, kind of merging of that way. But as we get people more settled, and we have, really empires. You have the Roman Empire, you have the Persian Empire. We'll talk about the rise of Islam, and then we get to the Mongols and the Ottomans and all these. We're really talking about empires here, and then there's cities and there's trade and there's all these things. How does the spirit, I guess, of nomadic culture kind of live on through many of these huge empires, through wars, through conflict, through civilizations, if you will? How does it still kind of survive and thrive, right? It's not just, okay, now we settle, but there is still, I mean, we'll talk about the Mongols, but I mean, there's a heavy, nomadic, if you will, culture there, or identity, if you will. So how does it kind of persist through, the last, 2,000 years, throughout all of these various empires throughout many parts of the world, I guess?
Yeah, that's a big question. In a way, that's why I wrote the book, because I was brought up in England, and where nomads are not necessarily part of the everyday. Although we had travelers, these people who would turn up and park themselves on the common in the village, and it's like, well, where have they come from? How long are they staying? Look up your daughters, all that stuff, and yet when I started traveling, I as a teenager, I went to the Middle East for the first time. I've been going back there ever since.
That's wonderful.
And then I lived for a while in Cairo for some years, and there you realize that there are no nomads in Cairo, but you don't have to go very far before you see brown tents. And they're just part of the everyday. I mean, it's not like, oh wow, look at that, they're nomads. It's just that everybody knows about it, and yet, and again, it's sort of I come back to my education. I mean, I supposedly had a very good education, and I studied history through to 18. Nobody ever mentioned nomads. I mean, the three nomads that we might have been taught that you could name check are Attila the Hun, only mentioned because he brought down the Roman Empire, right. Genghis Khan and Timur or Tamburlaine as the great bloodthirsty, barbarians of the steppes. That's it. And so you put these two things together, the reality I was seeing by traveling, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, and south of Sahara as well. And then, with what I was taught, and you think, well, hold on, these two things don't fit together. And then I read this account by a very eminent historian, Felipe Armesto Fernandez, who was professor of history at Oxford and Princeton. I mean, a very, very accomplished, important historian. And he described history as a path picked through ruins. Wow, it's a very, very neat description.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
Unless you're a nomad. Because if you're a nomad, the only role you can have in this vision of history is as a destroyer, because you don't build monuments. This image is, in the distance, we now have Göbekli Tepe, and then we have the pyramids and Stonehenge, and we come forward and we have all these beautiful, Gothic churches, and we come through to New York, Chicago skyscrapers, and and over time these things are turned into ruins, and history sort of weaves its way through them. Well, it doesn't compute. It leaves out half of the human story, which is why I decided I was going to try and write this book. And But I would also say, in his defense, this eminent historian, that he did also point out that empires come and go, as you say, but the most enduring of all human forms of existence is hunter-gathering and nomadism. There were nomads and hunter-gatherers before anybody settled, and they're still doing it now. They might be in reduced numbers, although I think the number of nomads on the planet is pretty stable, and it has been for quite a long time. It's just that the number of settled has gone up so astronomically that in proportion they have become increasingly isolated. But so to come back to your question, it's a fundamental state of existence for humans, nomadism. As I mentioned, a huge amount of the planet is not suited for agriculture, so there's still plenty of opportunity for nomads to go about their business. And in the middle of the book, I write about this 14th century historian, sociologist, philosopher, Ibn Khaldun, who comes up with his, he's doing something really radical. He's sitting down, looking back over the last 1,000 years and trying to work out, well, what is the human condition? What's going on here? Why do empires rise and fall? And he's writing this in what's now Algeria. His family originally came from Arabia. They had been grandees in Andalusia, down in southern Spain, at the time of the Arab kingdom there. And he'd seen kingdoms come and go in his own time. He'd been a courtier in Morocco. And he had, so he's sort of thinking, what happens? What is the process here? And he regards nomads as the original pure form of for humans. These are the bravest and best. Crude, yes, but honest, noble, able to fend for themselves, looking after each other because you have to live in a community in the desert, and so on. And then there's this process where they're attracted to the power of one particular ruler who will bring them out of their inevitably desert or mountain place of origin into a town, a city, or whatever. They will overwhelm the place because they are so powerful. And then the ruler will settle. He'll live in a palace. He will put up a wall. He will lose that contact with his original people. He describes this as asabiya, which is sort of like a group feeling, which can, the sum of the parts is much greater than any individual. That together, a group of people can do extraordinary things, and they do. And so Ibn Khaldun charts the rise and fall of empires, and he's fascinated by the rise and fall of the Arab Empire. I mean, the Arab Empire is so unusual and so incredibly successful because in two lifetimes, or actually in one lifetime, the beginning, with the last part of the Prophet Muhammad's life and then his successor, you get this huge energy coming out of Arabia. The first time the Arabs encounter a Byzantine army, by mistake, they have this huge battle and do incredibly well. And the Byzantine emperor is saying, who the hell are these people? We've never even heard of them. And then, within 20 years, a big chunk of the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, has fallen to the Arabs, the whole of North Africa, and as I say, up, and they're at the gates of, they're pushing up into France, they're at the gates of Europe. And how does this happen? Well, these are people nomadic. Their nomadic character is of the essence to them. And they never forget it, although they lose touch with it. And they have never forgot it. I mean, I still go, every now and again to the Arabian Peninsula, to the United Arab Emirates or to Abu Dhabi. And there you see, the people who are born now, most of them have no memory of their pre-oil existence. But I gave a talk about nomads in Abu Dhabi last year, and it was fascinating because there were some people in the audience who did remember, who were born in a hut somewhere, and now they live in great opulence. They're among the richest people on the planet. But and they're worried about having lost that connection, about losing their identity in the process of settling down. And I mean, obviously there's some extraordinary, bizarre, and uncomfortable aspects to this. I went to a fair where people were buying, they're like sort of amazing 4-wheel drive camper van things with to go out into the desert and sort of reconnect with their nomad roots, but with with a double door American fridge and a drop down cinema screen and and a Starlink dish on the roof, because you can't just go into the desert. I mean, you might get into trouble. So
hilarious.
It's a very, but I love, but I mean, it's a real problem because and actually the governments of those states are putting a huge amount of money into trying to hold on to their core nomadic identity. Because, if Ibn Khaldun is right, and I think he is, that process of coming out of a rawer, more pure, less complicated, less cluttered life as living as a nomad to a settled one is very compromising and very, very difficult to maintain the qualities that you had before.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting how that works. I had a conversation not that long ago with Michael Cook, who wrote this wonderful book on the history of the Muslim world, and his central claim so it's been obviously documented that really there was who wrote Goldsworthy wrote this wonderful book about Rome and Persia for 700 years fighting in peace, and it really was the rise of Islam and the conflict that they would have. And so it was in Arabia with nomadic groups, and then they get into Syria, and then it's off to the races, and they really break up that kind of duality of sorts between the two empires. But Cook's idea is that with Muhammad, he created a religion and a state, which is at the same time, and they were kind of linked and sort of kind of have been actually, and really, really interesting because as you see and you talk about it in the book, the Abbasid dynasty and then the Umayyad dynasty afterwards, it becomes more settled, cosmopolitan, multicultural. It gets into Persia. And it's interesting how you're describing currently, in the Arabian Peninsula, that it's, people are going out into the desert with, with, a pull down, theater screen and stuff. But even in the early beginnings, it seems that it wasn't just nomadic. It was becoming more settled and more trade and more cosmopolitan. I mean, how much of, you could generally say, you get more players involved, you have more variables. So you have, Arabs from kind of the south, and you have the Persians, and you have the Romans or the Byzantines, and, whatever, and you have all these nomadic groups interspersed. But do you think it's just something along the lines of, as you get more players involved, more variables, you could start to lose some of that, I don't want to say purely, but that kind of nomadic culture of just kind of moving about and where do you feel that kind of gets lost sometimes in some places?
I think it's really difficult to run an empire and maintain your nomadic roots because you need a capital. I mean, some people do it. Chinggis Khan, I think, manages pretty well. Yep. But the problem the Arabs have, the early caliphs, who the rulers of this, you mentioned it's both religious and political. Church and state are united in a single figure, and also that they've come out of a very a relatively unsophisticated environment in Arabia, Mecca, Medina. And they move, the first capitals they go to Damascus. And the model for Damascus is absolutely Byzantine. I mean, the great mosque in Damascus, which happily is still standing, unlike the one in Aleppo, is absolutely Byzantine. I mean, you can, and it's built on top of what was a Byzantine church, and before that a Roman temple, and before that, so it's a sacred place. They're just accepting that they are the new people in town. But then they move to Baghdad, and that's interesting because they're moving further away from the Roman Empire and going east. And Baghdad is a whole new city, although there are lots and lots of ancient and very, very ancient cities in that area. But they create a whole new city. It's a round city. Literally sort of a big circle, and it's supposed to be sort of reflect it's the center point of a turning world. It's, it reflects the wheel on the cart. It points in all directions. It's an attempt to embrace the nomadic nature of the empire, but inevitably it becomes the palace. It becomes no-go area for most people in the city and most people in the empire, and the emperor, the caliph, becomes cut off from everybody. And actually what happens particularly in Baghdad, in that Baghdad period, is that the Persians, who understand entirely about running empires, because they've done it themselves for quite a long time, find themselves in really key positions running the Arab empire, the Muslim empire, and continue to do so. And they give it a very Persian atmosphere and structure. And I think a lot of the art that comes out of there, a lot of the desire for the buildings that go up in Baghdad, and perhaps also for the House of Wisdom, is to do, which is this famous depository of knowledge, is a Persian influence. But at the same time, and during this period in Baghdad, the time of Harun al-Rashid and his successors, famously the Caliph of the Arabian Nights, you have scholars going back down into Arabia, because there is a sense that they've lost something in this transition. And so they're going and they're recording pure Arabic, because although people are still talking Arabic, I mean, the caliphs are still talking Arabic, but it's being changed, it's being Persianized, it's being Romanized, it's being, it's in the way that English is now, how many loaned words from former colonies does English now carry, and and American English, which has got mixed in with it, and that was happening with Arabic, and so they go back trying to find people who still spoke the pure, untainted Arabic, and it's a sense of anxiety that some people had of what was happening in the process of building this empire. That what was being lost was their initial character, and it seems to be an inevitable part of the process, and it therefore makes them weak, because the glue that held them together, that bonded them, is lost, and therefore it begins to fracture, and makes them vulnerable for the next lot to come along.
It's interesting. You had said that it's very hard to have a kind of nomadic empire. But Chinggis Khan certainly does it with the Mongols. I've talked about it. I've talked with her, and I've mentioned it many times. I mean, Marie Favreau wrote an amazing book, The Horde.
Absolutely brilliant.
Superb book. And really just kind of opened my eyes to it. And I guess for you, on this point, I mean, obviously many people talk about they were brutal and they were awful and they had slaves, and there's many negative and awful things to say about the Mongol Empire, absolutely. However, there is this incredible, it still just impresses me to this day, of so many people groups, so many cultures, so many languages. This administrative might, to me, is the one of the best things about the Mongol Empire, because it seems we can't manage and control in a modern era a small nation state, and somehow in the 13th and 14th century, Chinggis Khan was ruling basically the known world at that time. I mean, it spawned all over Europe and the Middle East and parts of Asia, and it's just how they were able to administratively manage such a massive empire and still have it nomadic at its essence and its identity. I mean, just from your perspective, how do you see that imprint of the nomadic identity with such one of the greatest empires ever? How do you see it?
Well, it's interesting because I think Chinggis Khan is really convincing argument for staying nomad. He had to build an empire, a capital for his empire. There had to be a center point, and it evolves in this place Karakoram. Initially it's just a set of tents, and then it sort of becomes a bit more settled. But he doesn't want to live there. He's constantly on the move. I mean, okay, a lot of the time he is fighting, but even when he's not fighting, he'll pass through, and then he'll go to his hunting grounds, and because at heart he is a nomad. And it's the same with I think it's the same, although he didn't come out of Mongolia, but came out of the western part of the steppes. It's the same with Timur or Tamburlaine. These are people who understood the power of remaining mobile, and the problem. Although Timur does a lot more to embellish cities, and particularly Samarkand, his beloved place that he devoted so much money and effort to turn into one of the world's most beautiful places. But he's always on the move, and seasonally, as well as it's not just on campaign, but between his summer and his winter places. And I think that is what allows them to maintain contact with their core group. And then, what happens with the rest of the people? This diversity of peoples that they conquer. We know, because we get taught in Western accounts, the bloody nature of these two rulers in particular. But I'm certainly not an apologist. I mean, a lot of people did die, but as I point out, a lot of people died at the hands of Crusader knights and others as well. It was how wars were fought at the time. And there's one thing I learned while I was researching this, which I hadn't known before, which I thought was really important in understanding this, and that is, these people are nomads. They have several horses. Each Mongol fighter has several horses that they have to feed. They can't do long sieges, but they're fighting people who live in cities. So you establish yourself, you surround a city, and you say, come out, bring out your head people. We'll do a deal. We'll impose our own lord on your city. But otherwise, you can carry on as normal. You just pay us tribute, and we'll move on. But if you don't, we'll destroy the place, and you'll all die. And it's a zero tolerance, but it's a zero tolerance driven by a really important this detail, and that is they can't do long sieges because they don't have fodder for their animals. So it needs to be quick. And I mean, as it goes on, they learn more how to do siege. They bring from China siege equipment and things like that. But I thought this was absolutely, this is fascinating detail as an explanation of why, and why why they've gone down in history as such bloodthirsty killers. And the other detail I have is, so Baghdad was supposedly sort of leveled again and again and again, and everybody is destroyed, everybody is killed, or the place is destroyed. And then 20 years later, it's another major trading city with many, many thousands of people. It's like, I think some of those accounts of the total destruction of Baghdad might have been a little exaggerated. Again, not apologizing for the murders, but
right.
But so I think the other key element for why this empire was so successful at holding everybody together, all this disparate people, they didn't care whether you were a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, a Zoroastrian, an animist, or whatever. It didn't really matter.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as the Arab Empire, not the same as the Christian empires before. And so you have freedom of conscience. And they were built on movement and on trade. So they're very happy, and this is particularly the case famously with Kublai Khan, of that same Chinggisid family, who there's a lovely story where he goes into the treasury, because he's then the ruler of China, and he goes into the imperial treasury and he sees all this silver and gold lying around, and he says, "What are we doing with this? Go and give it to people, and then it'll come back to us." Having magnified, having sort of, and so here's free market, here's early capitalism, here is the world as we understand it. This is banks needing to lend money in order that they can make money. It's all there in the beginning of in these early Mongol empires, and it's backed up by a really ferocious legal system. Where you might not get a fair trial were you to transgress, and so famously a young woman could walk with a bowl filled with gold on her head across the empire, and nobody would touch her, because if they did, the punishments are enormous, and there's a great story. The Spanish. This is again the time of Timur. At Samarkand, the Spanish king sends an emissary to Samarkand to see who this man is, this famous lord of the world. And while he's there, Timur is settling a few scores and has the elders of Samarkand brought out and hung. In front of everybody. It's just sort of, just it seems random punishment. At least that's how the ambassador describes it, just to instill fear in everybody, to make sure everybody's understanding that nobody is above the law. And I think if you have that across an empire, with this desire for people to mix and to move and to bring new goods and to bring your expertise, then you have a glorious moment, and I think it really is a glorious moment. I think that particularly with Timur, this 1400s, late 1300s, early 1400s flourishing of Central Asia, which I think is so important for helping the Renaissance to flourish, the European Renaissance. The travel writer Robert Byron talks about the Timurid Renaissance. And he looks at the beautiful buildings in Persia, particularly in Esfahan, and says, this could only come about through the mixing of a court culture with nomadic energy, and that the whole of Central Asia at that time and that big part of Eurasia is flourished by that combination of a court culture and nomadic energy.
Yeah. It's interesting, as you're saying this, it's such a marvel to me how, in some ways, again, things were more simple, but also somewhat complicated, I guess, in this time. But it's interesting how they'd make decisions, how they have a certain hierarchy, what their kind of rules were for things. There are two big groups that you kind of finish the book with. So you can just give me the main thrust of it. But obviously, I've talked a lot about this empire. And many people have written about it. Is the Ottoman Empire. I guess the thing that I want to ask specifically is about this. I mean, there's many things you could say about the Ottomans, good and bad, of course.
And many people have.
And many people have. And many people still will. But 600 plus years into modernity, it's amazing. It's spectacular. How much of what it means, I've talked about this a little bit before, how much of Ottoman identity, right? However you want to, whatever that is. And in some ways, and post-Ottoman, once you get the nation state of Turkey, it was, well, how do we remember that? But now we're Turks and we're not Ottomans per se. And what the difference is there? There's a whole thing with that. But how much of Ottoman identity was nomadic identity? How much of that is connected, or is it not connected? I guess for you, how do you see that playing out through, early, middle, late Ottoman periods?
Well, initially it's entirely nomadic, and the most Turkic peoples were living on the Eurasian steppe, the central or western part of it, and living nomadic lives. And the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Osman, comes out of a nomadic tradition himself, but they very quickly settle again. I mean, I think were Ibn Khaldun alive in the 17th or 18th century, he would certainly have focused on them, because they, talk about the dangers of settling in a palace. That what happens in the Topkapi, the difficulties of succession, for instance, where you have this room where the princes are kept, sort of cut off from the world and sort of, and eventually killed. But in case you need one of them, you can, but you don't want them to threaten the power of the ruler. But Suleiman the Magnificent, 1600s, 1500s, who's, very important in establishing the extent and power of the Ottoman Empire. Absolutely. Very often has himself presented in paintings as sitting in front of a tent. And in important ceremonial moments, he's sitting in front of a tent, and because he's talking to his people. This is symbolic. I mean, he did live in tents sometimes because he was on campaign, but he also lived in palaces. But I think it's still there and very much alive. The nomadic past, the sense that these were tent people, and as we were saying with the Mongol empires, the Ottoman Empire encompassed a huge range of people from European Christians down into North Africa and across into Asia. But some of the Turkish, what we would now call part of Turkey, Anatolia, for instance, a lot of that land is still very only suited for nomads. And so it wasn't just symbolic. I mean, the ruler may well have settled down, but a lot of the people were still living nomadic lives, and therefore it survived as part of the identity. And I know that there was. I mentioned that during the Baghdad period, that Arab scholars were going out of Baghdad in whatever that was, the 8th or 9th century, to go and find people who still spoke pure Arabic, who were the essence of Arabs. Well, the Turks were doing this in the 19th century as well. Yeah. The Turkish, the Ottoman emperor sent people to places in the hope of finding, the pure nomadic Turk. Mm-hmm. It's a similar thing, but inevitably this process that Ibn Khaldun identified of settling down doesn't help to maintain your nomadic qualities. On the contrary, you end up losing them, and that's what happens with the Turks. And for a long time in for the last century at least of the Ottoman Empire, it is called the sick man of Europe. And for a reason, it was constantly tottering on the brink of collapse, but it suited European powers to keep it functioning. There's a moment in the 1830s when Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was himself originally an Ottoman officer, moved his army up through Palestine, and he defeated the Ottoman army, and he could well have taken Constantinople, and he would have set himself up as the new ruler. And the British and French say, you don't want to do that because we'll intervene. Because they needed that counterpoint to Russian and Persian power. So but by then the idea of nomadic empire is long gone, and the sort of qualities that would help a nomad empire to revive had also long gone, because the days of being of nomad energy, of being good on a horse, of being able to quick with a bow and a sword were long past, because there were cannons and explosives and bombs. And so, yeah, that saw the end of nomad empires.
Yeah, it's interesting. We see the kind of, it phases out, this kind of nomadic power. Interestingly, though, in the last bit of the book, you can just talk about it briefly, but you talk about Native Americans over here in the Western Hemisphere, and interesting. I was, I guess, a little bit surprised. I mean, I don't think of them as nomadic, but I guess in a lot of ways they are. Maybe that's just American education system. We just get certain ways of thinking about Native Americans. And so yeah, I guess what is it the main thesis or essence you want to say about Native Americans here in, I guess, mostly in the United States, Canada, and even indigenous peoples up and down the Western Hemisphere, but in North America, how do we see them as nomadic? Yeah.
Well, because they lived mobile lives, and the teepee was a very mobile form of accommodation. And I mean, not all Native American tribes were nomadic, but some were, sure. and some of them were following the movement of bison up from up in what's now Canada down towards Gulf of Mexico. Down towards Florida, and that was a seasonal migration. They were herding effectively. They were being herded by these extraordinary numbers of bison that would then get killed in the 19th century. But yeah, so they are absolutely nomadic. And there's a great letter I came upon from Benjamin Franklin, the signatory of one of the fathers of the United States, signatory to the Declaration, who in, I think it's about 1750, he's writing to a friend of his in London, saying there's something he just can't understand. There are the settlers, he's in Pennsylvania, and the settlers, when captured by Native Americans, and I think it might be the Iroquois there, but I'm not sure, when they get brought back to the settlement, they don't want to stay. They want to return back to what he calls a wandering life. And Native American children who are offered education in the settlement, there's one group that come, and then the elders don't send, and so Franklin and his friends say, well, why won't you send your kids anymore? And the elders say, well, because we tried that once, and when you sent them back, they were good for nothing. And he just can't understand. He said, with all the advances of a settled life, with the advantages of our arts and sciences, why would even white women prefer to go back and live a wandering life than stay with us? And he just cannot understand the attraction of this mobile life, and I think from then on it's a sort of lost cause until our own time, because settled people are so convinced of the superiority of their way of life. It's only, I think it's increasing. It was a 20th century thing that nomads began to be talked about again, and in this, as I said at the very beginning, in this very romantic way of the free life. You can go where and do what you want, and which of course in no way reflects a nomad life. I write about the English lady and novelist Vita Sackville-West, who goes to Iran, to the same tribe that I went to, the Bakhtiari. And she wonders what it would be like to, she lives in this beautiful house in England and whatever. But she wonders what it would be like to live there in that place, in that way. And it reflects an anxiety already, in the same way that the story of Gilgamesh reflected an anxiety, a couple of thousand years earlier, in the human impact on the world around us. And also the increasingly difficult ways in which people were living. Post-industrial revolution, most people's experience of living a settled life has been difficult, increasingly difficult. And we now have more than 50% of people living in urban environments. on the planet. It'll be 75, apparently by 2050. 75% of people will have no connection whatsoever to what I would regard as the natural world, which is sort of the great unfettered outside. One thing that is absolutely essential, and it's a point I make with the nomads I visited in Iran, is that they know everything about the world around them because they're entirely at its mercy. So they know every animal. They know what the clouds mean, what the winds mean. They know when it's going to rain. They know when it's going to freeze. They know when it's time to move because there won't be any fodder left for their animals because the summer's coming. They know all these things. And it was humbling to be with them because I knew so little.
It's interesting. I had a conversation, I can't remember with whom and what, I think it was a biologist. I'm blanking on what conversation this was. But he said we have this great migration inside. People don't live outside anymore too much. They live inside houses, inside buildings, inside cities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that, it is the majority now. And I'm not by any means saying that we all need to, be on the tundra and live in tents or things like that. But it is interesting in how things have switched. I guess the last question I have for you is on this point is, we still have nomadic groups among us that live in different parts of the world. And I think, as we talked about at the beginning, that's a very kind of human way of being. It's kind of the way you framed the question was, why do we settle and things like that? And we continue to do that so much. And so I guess as we move further along in the 21st century, where do you think is the kind of, future or how the nomadic spirit lives on, or identity, or how we do these things? What do you think about the future of nomads, I guess, in the 21st century?
Well, I think nomads themselves will carry on. I mentioned it. I think the numbers of nomads on the planet have been relatively stable, and for that reason that I mentioned at the beginning, and that is that a lot of the land is no good for anybody else. I mean, farmers can't use it, and if there are no exciting mineral rights to be had, then, well, why not herd it? Get your herds up there and do something with it. But I think there's something also, which is something I touched on, I'm fascinated by, and I don't know enough about it because not enough research has been done about it. But it's what was called the nomadic gene. And I think this is fascinating because clearly a lot of people do have difficulties living in settled places and living in within four walls. And what these researchers from Northwestern University in the United States found was that successful nomads in East Africa, from the Arial tribe, part of the Rendile in Kenya, Uganda, what they have the successful members of the tribe have the same variant gene as children in the United States who are diagnosed with learning disorders, ADHD. And the suggestion is, and as I say, unfortunately, not enough research has been done on this yet. But the suggestion is that it requires a different wiring of the brain to live a settled life. That 12,000 years ago, before Göbekli Tepe, we all lived on the move. And 12,000 years in human evolution is yesterday. Not even yesterday. It's tea time today.
Right. It's a couple hours ago.
A couple of hours ago, yeah. and yet we are expected to live and behave and think in a completely different way, and in a very simplistic way of describing it. To live in a city, very often you are expected to think in a convergent way. There's a single answer to every problem. The light doesn't work, well, fix the bulb. Children put through exams, and particularly I'm thinking about children who are diagnosed as having learning difficulties. Everything is a tick. It's a yes or a no. It's a right or a wrong answer. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, 1 and 1 does make 2, but it also makes 4 if you're talking about halves. Or, it depends how you see things. You still end up with the same end result, but the way you get there is different. And yet, when we were living on the move, we were required to think divergently. We needed to have a whole set of different options in case this happens or that happens and that happens. And settled life doesn't encourage that. And I think that one of the things we can learn, and maybe, I'd love more research to be done on this. What I've taken away from writing this book, and it was 8 years of my life from the beginning to the end. One of the things is the absolute imperative that more of us have an understanding of the natural world as a way of understanding the consequence of what happens when we turn on our light bulb, when we flick the switch, when we turn the tap and there's hot water, all that stuff, but which mostly we don't think of, and therefore the consequences on the global scale are enormous. And the other is about convergent thinking, encouraging people to think in a more diverse way, to think with a multitude of options, and because our world is changing dramatically. What it required of you and me is not what it's going to require of our grandchildren. They will face something so completely different with AI and everything. So it's going to be important, I think, and I think those two things in particular will help moving forwards.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I'm obviously a big proponent of convergent thinking for sure. So I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah.
Anthony, this was so much fun. I absolutely just had a joy talking to you about a topic I really like, about so many periods of history. I like the framing. Your book is wonderful, and I just can't say enough for giving me and the listeners all of your wisdom and your wonderful insights. Much appreciated. So big thanks.
Thank you, Xavier. I've really enjoyed it. It's been good to go through it again.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.